Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you, our virtual audience, to Humanities Decanted. At the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, we created this series as a platform for humanities and arts faculty to share their newest scholarly and creative work with the campus and the public. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the IHC. I want to let you know that our conversation today will last for about 30 minutes, after which we will take audience questions for 10 minutes. At any time during the event, you can use the Q&A feature on your screen to submit your questions. And do note that the event is being recorded and will be available on the IHC website in 2 weeks. Before I introduce our interlocutors, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our guests, Professors Ben Olguín and María Josefina Saldaña-Portillo. Ben Olguín is the Robert and Lisa Erickson Presidential Chair in English and the Director of the Global Latinidades Project in the English Department. His interdisciplinary areas of expertise include Chicanics and Latinx literary and cultural studies, critical race and ethnic studies, human rights theory and praxis. He is the author or co-editor of 6 books, including 2 volumes of poetry. And I'd like to mention as well that civic engagement is integral to his scholarship. Ben has worked in community centers and schools in underserved communities, as well as in prisons, juvenile jails, and immigrant detention centers. Today, he will be discussing his newest book, Violentologies, Violence and Ontology in Latinx Literature, Film, and Popular Culture, which has just appeared with Oxford University Press. Ben will be in conversation with Professor María Josefina Saldaña-Portillo, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. Her research interests include Latin American and Latinx studies, development and globalization studies, and 20th century revolutionary thought and literature of the Americas. She has written or co-edited 4 books, including Indian Given, Racial Geographies Across Mexico and the United States, which in 2017 won the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Prize for the most outstanding book published in American Studies, and the National Association for Chicano Studies Book Award. It is my great pleasure to welcome Ben and Josie to the virtual IHC to converse about Ben's new book. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for inviting me to this dialogue, and thank you, Josie, for agreeing to be the interlocutor. It's always good to see you. As a prelude to this conversation, I want to share slides because they help ground terms of the analysis that I'm doing in my book, and also foreground the case studies. And I should add that I really do believe that we're in a really important moment in the humanities, which is informed very much so by ethnic studies, and of course Latinx studies. And I believe that Latinx studies is at an ideological crossroads, and that's what I want to talk about today. So let me share some slides to get started. Okay, here we go. All right. It is frequently assumed that terms such as Latinx, Chicanx, raza, and related nomenclature unambiguously signal resistance and opposition to capitalism and imperialism, but they do not. My book explores the ideologically inchoate nature of this field by alluding to what might be called the discrepant Latinx archive, to borrow a term Palestinian scholar Edward Said. This archive, which I assess among my book's over 100 primary sources, includes a vast body of material from the Latinx right wing, as well as a huge body of material that in eclectic, transversal Latinx subjectivities and subcultures across the ideological spectrum that are synthesized in contact zones throughout the US and globally. In many cases, these discrepant Latinx subjects make absolutely no sense when examined within the Latinx studies resistance paradigm that undergirds the field's central nodal points and central theoretical frameworks: mestizaje, mestiza, mestizo consciousness, transnational gnosis, etc. I submit that these discrepant Latinx subjectivities and the archive they have produced illuminate the complex mechanics of hegemony and also reveal the ideological vicissitudes of Latinx negotiations of power. They thus illustrate the profound and complex challenges facing us as we seek alternatives, especially from the left. The charge of a literary and cultural studies scholar revolves around reading, of course, right, broadly defined. So accordingly, in my book, I propose a relatively new hermeneutic and nomenclature for the field. It is informed by the field of violent studies emerging from Colombia in the 1970s, known as violentología, or violentology. This field includes, it's primarily a sociological field, but it involves a lot of cultural studies folks as well. This field examines how Colombian culture and society, and especially ways of being and knowing, have become inextricably intertwined with multiple forms of violence over a century of uninterrupted warfare. So I extend this notion as an operative prism for my book. And in my use, violentologies refers to distinct theories of being, or violence-based ontologies, and distinct ways of knowing, or violence-based epistemologies, which I give unique names such as Latin Orientalist, Chicanicide, Afro-Latin Indio, and others. Violentology is also a methodology that I deploy as a hermeneutic tool for explicating the materiality of violence, undergirding Latinx history, culture, identity, and ideology in particular times and places, and across time and place. And this is important because I don't see violence as outside of Latinidad, and that's what most theoretical trajectories in the field, and especially decolonial studies, which is really informing the field, see violence as sort of as aberrant and outside of subject formation, and I don't. So this multivalent term enables me to do several things. First, I push back against this investment in framing Latinidades as inherently oppositional. And I do this by, one, recovering and reassessing Latinx settler, colonialist, and elites across time and place. I contextualize the multiplicity of Latinx indigeneity paradigms, and Josie has done this, par excellence. So I'm informed a lot by what she's done. And I explicate, the ideological dissensus emerging from various Latinx spatial ontologies. I also recover broader Latinx political constellations from the far left to the far right, which really, again, just are outside the scope of much of what we do in this field. And finally, I map the multiplicity of transversal supra and post-Latinidades, as I mentioned earlier. So to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, let me just share a few of the case studies. And the first one is Jaime Salazar, who was given the name Juan Sanchez when he joins the French Foreign Legion. And he's a very interesting character because he is as pissed off at the US as any Chicana you'll encounter, but he's not a cultural nationalist. He's a counter-imperialist in the quintessentially imperialist organization, the French Foreign Legion. We have no way of accounting for him in the resistance paradigm, even as he's engaged in resistance, even as he's very much a transnational subject, etc. It gets more complicated. Actually, Felipe Rose is from a different iteration of this presentation. Hamza Perez is the lead singer in Mujahideen Team, a Boricua Muslim hip hop group that is cultural nationalists. They're advocating Puerto Rican independence, as part of an Islamic imperialist paradigm. He's a non-secular counter-imperialist who was very recognizable in cultural nationalist spaces, but not within the broader spiritual mestizajes that we have come to understand in the field. And my book also examines a really disturbing and discrepant archive, and that's the Chicanx and Latinx neo-Orientalists of various sorts, including feminist Orientalists, Ana Menendez and Stephanie Elizondo Grice. Really, I mean, it's almost, when you read their book, it's like reading A Passage to India. It's just so much of the colonial travel writing framework is at play, but they're not alone. J. Malcolm Garcia and Rodolfo Anaya set the groundwork for this in the 1980s. And there are many more, and I examined these. And they, again, disrupt the conveniently coherent resistance claims that we continue to teach and discuss in the field. And it gets worse. I examine a whole cadre of Latinx imperialists, including fascists, and paramilitary officers in the CIA and FBI and all kinds of special operations troops, as well as some retorts, to be sure. But it's just a war on terror. Cultural production is a mishmash, and it has forever disrupted the trajectory that we set out in the 1960s and 70s. Finally, I end with the play I hope we're all going to learn to hate. It's the Hamilton, right? And I offer a contrapuntal reading of this spectacle. And I propose that Lin Manuel Miranda forces us to recognize that the field's emphasis on oppositionality elides the way that performances of Latinx resistance have transmuted into salient claims to inclusion in and the center of the US empire, albeit with a few anti-racist reforms. So we come to our conversation. It's not, for me to decide what is to be done in the context of this discrepant archive's disruptive presence, right? I certainly have my opinions, and I look forward to sharing them and dialoguing with you. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of how we understand or whether or not we choose to continue ignoring this archive, it is insisting on center stage, especially as the Latinx middle and upper classes continue to grow. We have a huge political elite and a growing elite senior military caste. And of course, the lumpen is ever present, disrupting everything, which we have not really even dealt with so well. So with that, I will turn to Josie and look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to read this book with care. One always gives a bit more care when you're, part of the conversation. So it's an incredible accomplishment, Ben. I mean, I'm just amazed, and I applaud you for extending, Guillote Hernandez's scholarship, for example, on 19th century Mexican-American violence against indigenous peoples to the 20th and 21st century in this idea of soldiering and soldiering for the right as well as the left. You extend Jerry Cadava's scholarship as well on conservative Latinos, again, given it materiality and these ways in which this conservative Latinidad expresses its own citizenship through imperial soldiering. And your readings of the literature, the film, the plays, the musicals, they're just exquisite. And you're kind of taking on Latinx masculinities within this context is really, really great. But you have written a polemical book. And so there's so much that I agree with, and I celebrate you for, and I especially celebrate the way in which it moves Latinx studies forward out of what you rightly identify as a dated and limited paradigm centered around resistance. But of course, there's much I vehemently disagree with, but we'll have to wait for drinks for that. You've written a polemical book, and it's the nature of polemics, to draw out that and you have to, because you don't shift paradigms without disturbing orthodoxies, and you've thrown down a gauntlet, and I look forward to another generation of Latinx scholars taking that up. So I've prepared two-part questions, and the first is around your use of the term violentology. You use it because it combines ontology and epistemology for a study of violence in Chicanx and in the Chicanx and Latinx experience, and especially in Latinx culture production. It allows you to interrogate the logic of violence perpetrated by and represented by Latinos, Latinx peoples, be that violence from left-wing resistance fighters or right-wing soldiers of fortune. And it really you've really broadened the Latinx canon by bringing in so many texts, and that on soldiering, that challenge Latinx orthodoxies. But my first question is, are you committed to this argument that violence isn't only at the heart of Latinx being ontologically, but also should be at the heart of Latinx theories of knowledge production? In other words, is violence, as you argue in the book, and indeed, and conclude with, a prerequisite for being Latinx and the primary prism for understanding Latinx cultural production? Do you see it as that kind of prerequisite?
No. So I don't see it as a new master narrative, but what it's been utilitarian, and that's important. And it has enabled me the focus on different types of violence. The interpersonal, systemic, epistemic, military, etc. All the different kinds, and there's just no end. It has enabled me to reemphasize the experiential. I'm informed by the Latino 19th century, that the work that's being done there in that particular anthology starts by questioning the category and the terminology Latina, Latino, Latinx, and there's a dissensus, but they call our attention to the experiential component, and that enables us, because most of them are historians, enables them to follow the archive and the subjects, regardless of a fetish on an oppositional argument. The historians are a bit more reserved in productive ways. In literary and cultural studies, we focus so much on agency, and we're still in this oppositional mode. And whenever we use the term Latina, Latino, it already carries so much baggage. So by invoking and borrowing from the Colombians this idea of violentology, I'm able to look at the way we negotiate violence and then talk about ideology, as opposed to use a term like Latinx and allow the assumed counter-hegemonic valence to still carry so much force, and I think ultimately distract us from what might be going on. Because I can tell you, any number of these texts, in fact, many of the texts I examine have been framed as oppositional, and they're not. Not even a little bit sometimes, So so this was at one level a utilitarian thing. I'm not invested in saying we all now have to map all future Latinidades as functions of violence. No, but we cannot ignore two things. One, that different violences are not antithetical to Latinidades. It's not like, as some decolonial scholars argue, that coloniality is violence and it introduced it to a space where it didn't exist before. That's not true. It's not like the Europeans.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I mean, so it has a utilitarian function, and it's very useful. And again, the Colombians use it just to say, okay, we're sociologists of violence. I give it a little bit more valence because by using it as a neologism, violence, ontology, epistemology, ideology, in that one term, enables me then to also signal unique iterations, for instance, such as now in this point for this question, I name specific iterations such as a Chiganice, a second generation Chicano, who really uses his transculturated abilities to deploy violence in a uniquely right-wing fascist even way that is still transnational, transcultural, trilingual, etc., but not oppositional. And
It
so,
lets you bring in by showing us the similarities between violence, in the service of resistance. It allows you to talk then about violence in the service of empire, which was really just really eye-opening. And you do revisit a lot of, for those, this is also to get people interested in it, but you revisit, I mean, I'm like, I don't think I'm ever gonna be able to teach a class on anything without having it at my fingertips, because you revisit a lot of classics. You revisit a lot of classics from the Latinist canon and give it a very different read. And you've kind of answered my second question, which was, so we don't really have to go over it. I was just thinking of like, how would you still try to categorize in some way or characterize in some way the difference between, revolutionary violence and fascist violence, and that you recognize in the soldiering and the war on terror, right? That broad, well, even in World War II, you have this odd Latinx identification with Japanese fascism, and so I wonder if you could would you like to try to characterize that, or is that really not something you're interested in?
There's so many precursors here, and two others, two other frames of reference are, of course, Frantz Fanon. He couldn't solve that. He was an advocate of revolutionary violence, and he also recognized that it is an issue. It's a problem. You can't get rid of it if it ever was something that was introduced, and not an a priori presence. But Akil Mbembe also, in his necropolitics, really presents it, in a non-celebratory way, because it's not a good thing, So there are there's a lot that we can learn from pacifism, from the pacifists. They're negotiating violence too. Their activism is a violentology, but they're not wielding an overt one unless they're doing a hunger strike and wielding it on themselves. It's a different discussion. But no, I'm not. I don't want to reify violence. I don't want to celebrate that. It is a problem. There's got to be a way to have a different form of society. Old school Marxists will tell you, about their golden age theory of, idyllic clan communism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's an argument I want to believe in. I want to believe that there has been a space in human history that wasn't defined by competition and warfare. I think there can be a future for that. I don't have the path to that. No one I examine certainly doesn't either. The decolonial turn promises something like that, but who knows?
Well, who knows? Indeed. Okay, because we don't have that much time. I'm gonna go to the second question, and of course, I was given my own scholarship, very, very intensely interested in all the ways in which you talk about mestizaje. Like, you're revising, you're rescripting mestizaje, and again, you're giving us a vision of mestizaje in all of these different ways, like the Hispanonice, and in all of these different ways in which or the Latin Orientalists, right? These ways in which violence is part and parcel of the mestizo experience. But again, I'll ask them both at once. Like, can we does mestizaje always have to be anchored in violence? Like, or is there a way? Because when, for example, you're talking about the Boricua Islamic hip hop, you always do bring it back. You do always bring it back to violence. But I mean, is there a way of imagining mestizaje free of the trope of violence? Not to celebrate it. I'm not trying to celebrate it, but in other words, mestizaje is a huge umbrella, which is why it allows you, to move from, Anaya in a kind of bringing together through mestizaje, the indigenous, the Asian, and the Chicano, all the way to the kind of like militaristic mestizaje. Is there a way to imagine it? And my other question is, I liked all of those terms that are impossible to pronounce, but that you put out there, because they in fact reminded me of the Casta paintings. The Casta paintings, every single category is named. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on what that is allowing you to do, using those new terms.
Yeah, and I'll start with that. that gives me precision. And I'm right now, I think the main thing I want to do is introduce so much precise analysis of specific modalities of Latinidad that we have to resist uh, overstating and re-inscribing master narratives without denying the coherence of these subjects. You know, it's not a postmodern move. It's not a postmodern relativist move. So the precision helps us see the diversity within the diversity within the diversity. So it is going to irk someone, a lot of people, because there's so many neologisms, but I think they serve a purpose. The issue of violence and mestizaje is very interesting. Again, there's a preface. I think the first preface or the first epigraph is from Ansaldúa, who maps mestizaje as a function of violence at the same time as she imagines into that violence. So she is taking us somewhere. She's taking us somewhere in a lot of different ways, and it's very highly problematic, but productive in some of the turns she makes. There are so many other ways, and one of the chapters I had to cut out was on queer in the Alamo. And queer camp was so important. Rascuachismo is queer. Don Rascuache was a queer subject, and he's a quintessential mestizo, mestisex subject. So there are models and iterations that really do reject violence. And in fact, one of the case studies in one of the chapters when I discuss Emma Perez, I talk about how her novel fails to give us a character who is able to give us a mestiza subject and a paradigm of liberation outside of violence. She just can't get out of it. Mm-hmm. And it's a good problem. It's a good rendering. But there are others who can. For instance, somebody I had to cut from the book, Victor Hernandez Cruz, for instance, is on a reverse migration as a Boricua. He goes to southern Spain, and for him, southern Spain is Africa, as it is for many people. It's a very subaltern. And he's on a reverse migration of mestizaje that is always reserved. It's never overstated, but it is a process. So there are many ways. I think Felipe Rose also does, through his really disruptive performances that have upset a lot of people in Native American studies, but he's Native American. He's from Lakota Sioux. His father's Lakota Sioux. But he identifies as Taino as well. He's Boricua, as Black as well, as gay. And he's got a lot of mestizajes working, and it is fundamental to his aesthetic and to his discourse. So, yeah, I'm disarticulating mestizaje from violence by noting how we have, unfortunately, ignored the violence that Ansaldúa started with. I mean, when you hear people talk about mestizaje and borderlands, you think it's Disneyland. It is not that. It is horrifically traumatic in its framing initially. So I remind us of that, but also point to the aspirational.
Yeah, it's herida abierta, as she says, right? Like that's really the open wound of mestizaje. The other, I guess the other, I'm just going to go to Hamilton. We got to get to Hamilton because everybody, and the thing about that play is that it is, in a way, to me, the compromise that was made with the Chicano. It's the culmination of the compromise that was made between revolutionary Chicanx, Latinx nationalism and cultural nationalism. And so you get to this place where you actually have this multicultural inclusion that is Hamilton, right? Into this overall narrative where he is, basically enlisting a cast of minorities to give praise to the founding fathers, as you mentioned, ignoring Alexander Hamilton's wife's slave-owning family, the decimation of indigenous peoples, in order to do that, right? Even though it is an all minority cast, with the exception of King George. And I wonder how part of it, I think, is that, and I was, just because I was teaching Ramon Saldivar yesterday. And, you know, he's so precise in the Chicano narrative. It's about the Chicano narrative isn't anything that's been written in Mexican American literature, right? The Chicano narrative is that narrative which can demystify ideology, right? Can focus on the dialectic between oppression and the oppressed, and demystify that for the reader. And I wonder if you're thinking of violentology in a way as working in that way, and then just what you think. I mean, I'll be really honest. Within 10 minutes, I was weeping, and I did not stop crying. Even though I was hating myself while I was crying watching Hamilton, within 10 minutes, I was crying. And there's something about that musical form, right? Which is why it's so seductive and problematic in the ways that you're suggesting. But anyway, I want to know if violentology is a way of thinking, okay, you're kind of going the opposite direction. Violentology allows you to bring everything on board. You know what I mean? It allows you to just, you know, really look at all Latino production, regardless of its ideological bent.
Yeah, and well, in terms of Hamilton, I think Violentologies is probably the best way to look at that play, because it will focus on, or will call your attention to the many ways violence is operating. It could be through affect. You know, opera has that impact. You don't have to understand the language and you're feeling it. And it's kind of a hip hop opera. It's described a lot of different ways. That particular play has, for me, so many claims and moves to the center that I can't surrender to the impact. But I haven't seen it live, so I've only seen the bootleg copies, and then but I would say, though, that Hamilton is the quintessential violentological spectacle, because it actually redeploys violence in a way that some early cultural nationalists did, to mystify, to profoundly mystify. It isn't going to educate anyone into realizing that we have been complicit in hegemony. It is going to celebrate not just complicities that it doesn't talk about, but it's going to celebrate a claim to being part of the empire and being the center of it. And it's just, to me, ultimately, probably one of the most damaging pieces of art that has ever been produced by any Latino, Latina, Latinx subject. And it probably will be for a very long time.
I'll take West Side Story over it any day in terms of its ideological critique, you know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But,
and even though that is so exoticist, but yeah.
But still, it's legitimate class consciousness and critique and, you know, Codian discursive analysis. Every song is kind of like deconstructing America and the exceptionalism, whereas Hamilton is really reinscribing exceptionalism and as I said, like hijacking people of color into that exceptionalism. But we should turn it over to the audience now, Ben. As much as you and I will have to continue this conversation over drinks at a bar someday, but it is 7:35.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you for that incredible self-restraint, because I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to hear more between you two. However, so thank you for that. This was really a great sort of segue into what's clearly a contentious and original piece of writing. I'm going to start with a couple of questions from our audience members. The first is the following. Ben, how much does the phenomenological weight of violence itself matter in your argument? In other words, do the different kinds of violence matter in your argument?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They do, but there's two maneuvers here. First is to use it as the utilitarian tool that helps us get away from terms that already impose an understanding of Latinx ideology. So in turning to violence, though, we have to be specific because there's so many different forms. And we deal with everything from colonial violence, which is not going to bring any illuminating, empowering, liberatory realities. All the settler colonialists I examine, I show how that violence is compounding horrors. But I also, when I turn to some of the revolutionists, I resist celebrating revolutionary violence because, in fact, the revolutionaries primarily from Nicaragua and also El Salvador, the Chicanx internationalists who went to fight in those wars or went in solidarity, including Josie, who was a Sandinista at one time, right? And those forays into a revolutionary space are intertwined with navigations of other types of violence. So, for instance, Alice Bagg, who the punk rock singer, really illuminates and demands our attention to domestic violence, and she learns to name it as a punk singer, but she learns to situate this as part of global systemic violences as a Sandinista. So there is a different impact and resonance and experience of violence there. It enables a different epistemology, so to speak, but it's still ugly and it's not good, and it enables some insight into the ugliness and the goodness, whereas a lot of the settler colonialists and the fascists and just the all the other iterations of violence that I examine, there is more compounded horror. There's not, without even potential demystifying, illuminating payoff at the end, so to speak. But it generally is a depressing book. There's a little bit of, there's a lot of spectacle, but there's some depressing things. I mean, when you read Fanon, you're not happy, and I'm not comparing myself to Fanon, but I'm using, it's the same topic, colonial, global violences, and it's just, and interpersonal violences. There's nothing good about it, but it enables some insights that we need.
So can violentology be applied to Latinx constructions of Aztlán and pre-Columbian indigenous heritage? And if so, how?
Well, I spent a lot of time on Latinx indigeneity paradigms. And again, Josie's got several works on this topic and is really the person to go to for this. And there's a really interesting, she has a really interesting engagement with Ansel Dua as well. So I call your attention to that. I'm extending or participating in her call for a critical indigeneity studies by talking about different paradigms. And each of these different paradigms of indigeneity is intertwined with different, negotiations of power, and they're always coercive. Again, there's some people who break out. I think Felipe Rose is able to make some peace with some of the many hatreds he has to encounter on a daily basis in his own synthesis of a pan-Indian, pan-indigenous subjectivity. But so the answer is, can there be, does violentologies allow for Aztlán? Absolutely, but it critiques Aztlán as violence. So Aztlán is a very real thing to a lot of people. It's part of a huge apparatus, and it's become reified, and people live it, and it's whether it was constructed or not, it is now has a palpable dimension. So can many of these people who use Aztlán are gravitating towards Zapatismo, which, in case you haven't realized, they're not just anarchists. They started out as Maoists. So there is a lot of different possible permutations of Aztlán. And biology, just look at how they navigate power and deploy different violences, including facing particular tribes by claiming Aztlán. You have a complex of Aztlán and different indigeneity paradigms, and they're multi. So
Okay, thank you. Another question. How does your research challenge Chicano studies orthodoxy based on cultural nationalist and Marxist resistance?
Should I answer that for you, Ben?
Go ahead, please. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think that the orthodoxy that is really challenging is the premise, and I do think, you know, and you're taking aim at some fairly big guns in Chicano studies, who Latino studies too, but Chicano studies, like the prerequisite. Not, and again, it's like, you know, Saldivar was my mentor. I teach his book every year. I still think it's foundational, but he is very specific in saying Chicano literature, which we would say now Chicanx, is about resistance to hegemony. It's about deconstructing ideology. And what Ben is allowing us to see is, like, we can't really put on blinders to everything that's going on outside of that, you know, not an insignificant, but nevertheless just a portion of the cultural production of Chicanos and Latinos, right? And with this, as Ben points out, with like the more in which Latinos become part of the mainstream, the more in which we have like this, just, I didn't even know there was such a proliferation of memoirs about being in the war on terror, right? Or about, and we should have known this, I should have known this in the 20th century, about participating in East Asian imperial wars. So we have to come to terms with that. You know, I mean, I think Ben is really saying Latinx studies has to come to terms with everything that falls out of what I think was a necessary moment in Chicanx literary canon formation, you know, to say this is, it's a materialist analysis. It's not an experiential one. Saldivar, he's saying, let's call the canon this, you know, let's select for this, those authors who are transforming consciousness by focusing and deconstructing you know, oppression and exploitation. And Ben is saying, okay, well, yeah, that was then, and this is now. And suddenly we have to open our panorama. We have to open our eyes to all the stuff that isn't just existing alongside that, but it's an active contradiction to that. We have to come up with a way, a new model. It doesn't mean that we throw away Ramon's criteria, right? It means that we come up with more models for understanding the construction of a much more complex Latinx subjects, you know, and often fueled by imperial violence themselves.
I like that. And, you know, the X is yet another step, and we're going to take others beyond that. Thank you. That's actually, you're right on the mark.
You're welcome.
Perfect
And
place.
we are right on the time mark. We have arrived on the mark. So I must, alas, bid adieu to both of you and to our audience, but thank you all for coming. Please read the book. If you would take a moment to complete the survey, audience members, that will appear when you leave the webinar. You can also sign up for our mailing list there and also receive news about when this recording and other IHC events will be available. So again, thank you both very much. Thank you, audience. Thank you, questioners, and we'll see you again soon at the IHC. Good night, everybody.
Thank you
Ben.
so much.